What's going on, YouTube friends and family? Universal Fragrances here, and I'm back with another video on a subject that has been on my mind for a little while, and I think it's going to help some people out as well who have not had the experience or the time to possibly keep fragrances this long. But this is really a video about how fragrances age, especially when they get on to 15 to 20 years old, and is it even worth it to keep those fragrances that long? So just going over a couple things in my collection that I know are 19 to 20 years old or approaching that age. So we have the original batch, which I haven't seen anybody else online or any other reviewers have the original batch of Riverside Drive. I've been on this stuff for a while. I believe this came out in 03 or 04. All these fragrances were purchased between 2004 and 2006. You've got Creed Original Santal and the original 4-ounce bottles. This came out in 05, and I bought it about 6 months after it came out, so this is still the first batch that was ever done of Original Santal. And of course, Wall Street from Bond Number 9, which again, I think I purchased late 04 or 05, one of the first batches ever done of Wall Street. So not only are these fragrances very old, but they are also some of the original batches done of the fragrances in general. So just going to start off with one of my favorite fragrances of all time. Now, I do have the new version of this Bond Number 9 Riverside Drive, and you can see a big color difference here. The old one has gotten quite yellow. It did have a slight yellow tint to it when I bought it new, so it is different than the newer one in that regard, the new batch, to where it's clear. But it's interesting how 20 years have passed and this fragrance is still as good, if not better than ever. And even comparing it to the new release, they are very similar. For me, the pineapple is not quite as good in this one anymore. It's not quite as fresh and as acidic and citrusy. It's still very prevalent, but I think I like the pineapple note better in the new version of Riverside Drive. But I will say, and I have said it before in my other review, is you do get a little heavier oak moss and patchouli note in this. Maybe a very, very slight, hint of basil in terms of how much heavier it is than the newer batch. But over 20 years, this fragrance has just done extremely well. I've been saving it for a very good reason. It's nice to have it to compare to some of the newer batches, and I'm very glad I kept it for that reason, because that's actually how I started my channel, was doing comparison videos between the new batches of New Harlem and Riverside Drive versus the old original one. So this is a fragrance that has aged very well. I think that some of the green notes in terms of the oak moss and the basil have kind of shot up a little bit, and some of the other notes like the rose, the lily, and the pineapple, although they're still there and prevalent, they're not quite as good as they once were, and that could just be the fragrance aging, and again, some of the green notes coming out a little bit more. But man, this stuff, every time I open it, it's almost like it takes me back to my memories, in college and stuff like that. When I first bought it, people would always ask me what I'm wearing. Nobody had really heard of Bond Number 9 at that time, and then I got my friends on it, and they were all into designer fragrances like Armani and Jean Paul Gaultier. And it's interesting, whenever they would come over to my place, if they were going on like a date or something that night, they would come over to my place and then steal my samples of Bond Number 9. Of course, they would ask me, but they had their own fragrances, but that's just how much they loved Bond Number 9. They would take Highline, Wall Street, Coney Island. I had tons of samples back then, and my place was like always the stopping point before my friends would go out with a girl. They would always come by my place and steal my Bond 9. So good memories from that for sure. And another one they would like to steal was Creed Original Santal. And of course, this is one of the original first batches that was ever done of Original Santal. It was purchased early in 2005. And this is, of course, the 4-ounce bottle. And it has aged much like Riverside Drive from Bond Number 9. This has aged beautifully. The ginger, tonka, juniper, sandalwood, vanilla, cinnamon. I mean, it's like gourmand, but it's still fresh and spicy. It's not something that's overly sweet. It's not, too creamy. It's not too spicy. It's just very well blended. And if anything, this fragrance has gotten better. And again, over the years, it's been hard to tell how it's aged in the bottle because I don't wear it that much. But when I first got this, it did not have a yellow tint to it. And now if you look at it, the fragrance is quite yellow, much like Riverside Drive. So I think that's a good indication. Of course, with these niche fragrances, using the higher quality oils, they don't have parabens, phthalates, triclosan, dyes, and UV fillers in the fragrances. So natural color change with the oils aging and the terpenes aging in those oils, that's just something that's naturally occurring. And I will say, I didn't bring it with me on this video, but I do have a Davidoff Echo designer fragrance, which is more of a blue fragrance. If anyone remembers that one, it hasn't aged well. It has not. And I don't know if it's just because they use dyes in it. You know, the color has stayed the exact same over 20 years, which is a good indication that they probably are using UV protectants in there. They're probably using dyes for consistency. And it could just be because it's a blue fragrance with a lot of citrus and other notes like that, to where over time, that Davidoff Echo, it really has just become kind of syrupy and it's just weird smelling. It doesn't smell anything like it used to. It's not that great anymore. So not all fragrances age well, and it should be implied to a lot of people watching. But if you're new to fragrances, you got to keep fragrances much like you would single malt scotch and bourbons. You have to keep them away from the sunlight, try to keep them in a temperature controlled environment. You know, don't expose them to a lot of, you know, high variations in temperature change, and definitely don't keep them out in the sunlight for an exposed period of time. Don't keep them on a windowsill or anything like that where they're going to be getting direct sunlight, because they will go bad. UV light can definitely make a fragrance go bad. So that's just something for you guys if you're newer. Again, a lot of people watching my channel probably already know that information, but if you are newer to fragrances and you're starting a collection, I recommend keeping them in the box. And if you don't have them in a box, keep them away from light and keep them in an air-conditioned environment. So without any further ado, one of my favorite fragrances in terms of how it's aged is Wall Street from Bond Number 9. Man, the sea kale, the vetiver, the ambergris, cucumber, lavender. I'm not sure exactly what it is in this fragrance that has made it age so well. It's very reminiscent to when I first bought it. It doesn't quite have that kind of green freshness to it, although it's still very green marine, but it's definitely gotten a lot saltier. It's gotten a lot more complex, and it definitely has heightened a lot of those notes. It's definitely heightened a lot of the green notes to make them stronger, kind of like Riverside Drive, to where, you know, there are some things to this fragrance where they're not as fresh. The lavender's not as pronounced. But man, 20 years on, I could not be happier with how this fragrance is going. I wore it like 3 weeks ago and I was stunned just about, you know, how the longevity and the projection was in this fragrance. It is an eau de parfum, but again, the first thing to ever evaporate out of these bottles, even though they do suffer extremely minimal evaporation loss, the first thing to ever evaporate from a fragrance is going to be the water and the alcohol. It's not going to be the oils. So yeah, there is a chance over 20 years that the oil concentration in these bottles has gone up slightly, just because that's the last thing that's going to evaporate. You know, if you were to put these in an environment where they could last thousands of years, you'd probably just end up with like an oil gelatin kind of based substance at the bottom with all the alcohol in the water evaporating out. You would just be left with the oils in there. That would be the last thing to go. So for me, 20 years on, aging into these fragrances, I'm very glad I kept them all for this long. I never anticipated starting a YouTube channel, so they've been handy for that reason. But just as a collector and somebody who likes to wear fragrances, and also comparing them to some of the newer batches, these are some of my favorite ones. I do have some that are just as old, but in terms of how they've aged and developed, you know, these three have just gotten along beautifully over the years. I hope to have them for another 10 to 15 years because of all the things that I have in my collection. I won't wear these that often except for special occasions. And of course, maybe the occasional video to where I kind of want to bust them out and kind of do a comparison as well. But again, if you're a fragrance collector, you're starting something new and you're planning on having fragrances maybe for 15 to 20 years, maybe even pass them down on to your kids one day. This is something to keep in mind, that the higher quality fragrances you buy with the natural oils, and you're not getting all the UV fillers and all the other stuff in there, those fragrances, for my experience, I think they age the best. I really do. And that's not to say that designer fragrances don't age well, but just typical fragrances in general that you would expect might not age well, like a blue fragrance with all the citrus and the fruits in there. Some might be better than others depending on the oil concentration and the makeup and what type of oils they use. But in general, some of these heavier fragrances, especially ones with ambergris and gourmands and a lot of green notes and woods and patchouli and moss. In my experience, man, all these fragrances age extremely well, so it's not something that you ever have to worry about going bad. And they will change a little bit, but it's incredible how your memory is drawn back as soon as you open those bottles and you smell it and you're transported to a place, 15 to 20 years ago. And that's one of my favorite parts about fragrances. It's just how much they are tied to our memory and where they can kind of transport you. There's not a whole lot of other senses that are tied to memory. In fact, I think there's a scientific study that even shows that your sense of smell and kind of your memory, how it's tied in together, there's nothing more powerful than, how a fragrance affects your memory. So that's just one of the reasons I love them, but I wanted to do a quick video just kind of showing you guys how these fragrances have, aged over a 20-year period. I don't think there's a lot of other people that have fragrances that are that old. At least I haven't seen any reviews on YouTube. So just wanted to share that with you guys, and I hope you have a great rest of your week, all right? Bye.